Sarah was riding her bike home from school, but to her surprise, she arrived home ready to feed the cat. A tall figure suddenly appeared behind her and grabbed her. Sarah lost consciousness as she struggled and the police were called. Sarah was not only beaten, but taken to hospital with her injuries. Nick was the first to visit her in the hospital. Mary, who was in charge of the investigation, also arrived at the scene. There was no sign of the killer at the crime scene, but judging from some of Sarah's hair being cut off, Mary realized it was a serial murder because a female student at the school had been killed in the same way. The murderer also collected part of the victim's hair. However, luckily, this time the girl Sarah was revived by doctors. However, when Nick inquired about the girl Sarah's physical condition, I didn't realize that Danny, the surgeon from the city, was Nick's classmate. The two of them hit it off right away. Danny hadn't found a place to live yet. Danny offered to stay at Nick's house, and Nick agreed. As a newlywed couple, Nick's wife Laura was against it, but the spare room could be rented out and they could get some income. And since Danny was a good doctor, Laura didn't interface too much. Danny moved into Nick's house without any problems. The case of the girl called Sarah didn't go very well. Mary learned from the recovering Sarah that she hadn't seen the killer's face. This put a complete stop to the police investigation. This, however, made Nick uneasy. A few days later, a girl who was supposed to come to school didn't show up on time. The school called the girl's home, but there was no answer, which made Nick feel bad. He went to the girl's house to visit her. When Nick rings the doorbell, there is no answer, and even stranger, the door is unlocked. When he entered the house, Nick found that the computer was not switched off and the door was open. The hair on the floor was blown in by the wind, and Nick realized something was wrong. He rushed to the backyard to check, and soon found a red shoe on the grass. Following this direction, Nick eventually found a body in the bushes. It was the girl who hadn't come to school when the killer struck again and the girl was killed. Both the police and Nick were silent. However, the police only found traces of Nick at the scene. Apart from the semen on the dead body, there were no other clues. The police suspected that Nick had something to do with the case, and Nick was furious, although Mary was convinced that Nick didn't do it. But in order to get rid of the suspicion, Nick had to provide his own semen for DNA matching to prove his innocence. Nick had no choice but to follow Mary to the police station. What no one expected was that Nick's wife, Laura, felt very sick when she got home. Laura had abdominal pain and needed medication. This time the situation was serious, but Nick was not at home. Laura was in so much pain that she had to call the emergency services. Taken to the hospital, Laura was diagnosed with liver damage and needed surgery. Not only that, but the doctors discovered Laura was weeks pregnant. Although this increased the risk of surgery, the operation could be completed successfully by removing the necrotic liver. However, the physician's assistant found the situation to be even worse. The second layer of liver tissue still appeared to be faulty, but was very close to the uterus. If this part of the tissue was removed, Laura would never be able to have children again. However, Dr. Denny's experience dictates that the necrotic part must be removed. If we don't operate soon, Laura will probably not survive the night. If we remove a small piece of the second layer of necrotic tissue and send it in for testing, when the results come back, there's no time to lose. On the other hand, Nick rushed to the hospital after learning about his wife's condition at the police station. As the surgeon in charge of the operation, Danny could only tell Nick the bad news. However, Nick did not know that his wife was pregnant. The sudden shock was too much for Nick to accept, but in order to save Laura's life, as a family member, Nick finally agreed to Danny's operation. The surgical assistant reminded the doctor that Danny had not yet received the results of the tests. It was against hospital procedures to make his own judgment. Danny, however, felt that he couldn't afford to delay his life because of the operation. He gambled his career and performed the surgery on Laura. The operation was a success, but the test results left Danny dumbfounded. The second layer of liver tissue was fine. Danny's misjudgment cost Laura her reputation and her baby. Danny didn't think he was wrong. He just wanted to save Laura's life. When Laura woke up from her coma, she learned that she could not have children due to the doctor's bad judgment. Danny's apology was clearly unacceptable to her. Even her husband Nick was blamed by Laura. She chose to leave her husband, Nick, and Laura chose to sue the hospital. What Danny didn't realize was that Laura was relentless and had put the doctor who had just saved her life on the spot. This sent Danny into a rage. Although his judgment was wrong, his original intention was to save Laura. In the end, the hospital lost Laura's baby and her fertility because of Danny's missteps. As a result, the hospital's insurance company faced a massive $20 million payout. Dr. Danny's career ended prematurely. He also faced liability from the hospital, which Nick couldn't understand. His ill-advised decision made his wife Laura regard him as an enemy. Depressed at work, Nick didn't want to go home. Late at night, Nick's lamp suddenly went out. When he went to the basement to look for the bulb, he found someone else there. At first, he thought it was Bob, the school supply clerk, but when he went in, there was no sign of Bob. But in a photo on his bedside table, Nick discovers a shocking secret. Hidden inside is a strand of hair. The thought of this strand of hair makes Nick's heart skip a beat because it belongs to a young girl. The hair is linked to what happened to some of the girls at school. He finds another strand of hair in the box. Just as he's about to see what the difference is, Nick is startled when Bob suddenly appears behind him. When he sees the hair, Bob explains that it's his mom's hair, but Nick knew there was more to it than that. He doesn't want to argue with Bob, and Nick leaves as if nothing is wrong, but Nick hadn't gone far when Bob suddenly put a rope around Nick's neck and tried to kill him. Luckily, Nick was young and strong. Nick fought back and eventually pinned Bob to the ground. Detective Mary never thought that Nick would be the one who solved her difficult case. To repay Nick, Mary invited him to the pub for a drink. Mary hears about Nick's wife's misfortune, but tells him something even worse. At the last semen test, the police discovered that Nick was infertile. This left Nick even more dumbfounded, meaning Laura was for weeks pregnant and the baby wasn't his at all. A furious Danny defied the staff and went straight to Laura's solicitor. Nick discovers that Laura and her lawyer are close. He suspected the third party was the lawyer, but the lawyer made it very clear the lawyer had nothing to do with his wife. He was only in charge of Laura's case. All Nick wanted was to find Laura and confront her face to face. Although the lawyer sympathized with Nick's situation, he said he couldn't break the law by revealing his client's privacy. He told Nick to find another way to get to him through Laura's friends or her mother, but Nick told the lawyer,
"Did you say talk to her mother? She certainly knows Tracy better than I do. Her mother's dead."
Because Laura claimed that her mother died 12 years ago. Nick had never even met Laura's mother, which confused the lawyer. Apparently, Laura had lied again, which made Nick even more scared. He doesn't know his wife Laura at all, doesn't know what kind of person she is, and the lawyer seems to realize that the case is not that simple. The only way is to find Laura's mother. In the face of Nick's questioning, out of professional ethics, the lawyer did not give out Laura's mother's address, but the lawyer gave Nick a hint. That is to take the wine to meet Laura's mother. After asking around, Nick finally found Laura's mother's place. Laura's alcoholic mother agreed to have a chat with Nick. Nick learned from Laura's mother that she and Laura have very little contact. Laura's father is an unscrupulous liar. Laura's father abandoned her and her daughter when they were young. As a result, Laura grew up to be an unscrupulous person under her father's influence. This made Nick realize that his wife's marriage to him might be far from simple. Laura's mother told Nick that the whole thing was a hoax. Nick and the doctor, Danny, were both victims, meaning it was a total insurance scam. Who would do such a thing with Laura? Nick's first thought was Michael, the doctor who had treated Laura for abdominal pain. So Nick asked around and eventually found Michael's address. When Nick arrived, there was no answer, but Nick found Laura's belongings in a glass, which proved Nick's suspicions were correct. In order not to alert the police, Nick took the car and hid it. From the front of the house to the backyard, Nick found the door unlocked, so he slipped inside. However, just then, Laura seemed to be back here again. Nick rushed to hide in a hidden corner, only to see Laura walk in with a smile on her face and a trail of people behind her. Nick, who saw Danny, instantly frowned. How could he not expect that Mike, the doctor who treated Laura before, was actually Danny? The intimate relationship between the two made Nick have mixed feelings. It turned out that the third party was no other than his high school mate Danny. They planned this all along. As a teacher, Nick couldn't believe he'd come across something so outrageous. Nick realized why Laura had met him and married him. It was just a front. It was a seamless plan, but they'd been planning it for a long time. He was just a clown they were using. If it wasn't for the serial cases at school, Nick would never have learned the secret. Knowing the truth, Nick silently chose to go home. Nick was furious and decided to take revenge for their behavior. At that moment, Nick inadvertently found something. A syringe filled with drugs fell on the floor. The next day, Laura found the syringe on her bed, and then he realized something was wrong. Nick must have followed them here and discovered their secret, because that day he learned from Detective Mary that Nick couldn't have children. Nick went to Danny that night and told him the secret. If the baby wasn't Nick's, then the hospital wouldn't double the compensation. Laura would only get $10 million. And Nick wanted Danny to stop, but Danny says he doesn't want to do anything because it's not Danny's business anymore. Danny realizes that Nick is only doing this to get back at his wife Laura. Laura didn't realize that her plan to get pregnant to get more compensation would be a loophole that Nick would find out about, because no one thought Nick couldn't have children. And after her plan was exposed, Laura had no choice but to negotiate with Nick. At this moment, Laura also tried to sacrifice her sex to confuse Nick. Nick refused on the spot. The furious Laura thinks that Nick has no evidence, even if the police is useless. At this point, Nick reminded that Nick sent her an empty syringe. Nick had collected the residue that induces mutations in organisms and, if overdosed, can cause sepsis. Laura's abdominal pain and liver necrosis were self-inflicted. Nick also had an eyewitness, Nick's neighbor across the street, the little boy practicing his piano in front of the window. Because Nick hadn't had time to close the curtains after he bought the house, the boy saw Laura injecting the drugs. Nick got confirmation from the boy. Laura was horrified when she heard about it. Nick made his demands of Laura. He wants his share of the $10 million. If he dies in an accident, his will be mailed to the police. Laura went back and told Danny, who thought Nick was lucky he didn't blow the whistle. He agreed to Nick's demands, but Laura wasn't happy about splitting the money between the three of them, because she'd already sacrificed her fertility for it. She turned her attention to the boy, but the doctor couldn't imagine Laura being so cruel. Danny said he would never agree to anything that would harm the child. If anything happened to the child, Danny said he'd report Laura, but what Danny didn't expect was for Laura to pull out a gun. Danny tried to persuade Laura to put the gun down, but the desire for money had taken over. Danny was sent to God on the spot, and Laura came to the boy's house that night. When the boy's mother left the house to go to work, Laura broke in and lurked around the house. She snuck upstairs and opened the door to the boy's room. Laura took the cling film out of her pocket and walked towards the boy. The boy is soon attacked by Laura, who is horrified to discover that the boy is a dummy. And enraged, Laura realizes she's been tricked and it's a trap. Nick has been waiting for the boy for a long time, and Laura rushes straight at him. The two fall down the stairs. Laura was the first to realize and was about to grab a stick from the floor to hit Nick with it. But just then, the boy's mother stepped on the stick on the floor. Nick had already cooperated with the police and came here with a gun, pretending to be Mary. The boy's mother, the boy and his family had already been moved. The police's plan was to catch Laura and Danny on the spot, but Danny had already been harmed by Laura, which Nick and the police did not anticipate. That was the end of the insurance scheme, and Laura would spend the rest of her life in prison. What Laura didn't expect